Thank you all for joining us. This is our last session of the day and probably the most exciting one. My name is April DeMotts. I'm a supervisor for Montgomery County, and it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today. Stephen Moret serves as president and CEO of the Virginia Economic Development Partnership, VEDP, a role he has held since January of 2017. Prior to joining VEDP, Moret served as chief executive of the LSU Foundation and its real estate development arm, secretary of Louisiana Economic Development, and CEO of the Baton Rouge Area Chamber. At VEDP, he has collaborated with state, regional, and local partners to craft an ambitious vision focused on transformational goals, including accelerating employment growth, enabling every region to grow, and moving back to the top of national business climate rankings. He has led Virginia's successful state and local team bid for Amazon's HQ2 and launched a world-class custom workforce initiative, the Virginia Talent Accelerator Program. Please join me in welcoming Stephen Moret.
Thank you very much. What a great pleasure it is to be with all of you today to talk about the future of economic development in the Commonwealth. Now, I should share with you that I'm literally just off, I think Christy Morton, maybe an hour ago. We had a great Zoom call with Governor-elect Glenn Youngkin and our entire staff at VEDP. So not only will I have a few ideas to share with you, I'm going to share some specific things that he talked about that help to reinforce some of these same points. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about how sort of some of the divides between urban and rural Virginia, some of the progress that we've made over the last few years, and some of the big ideas that we have for the next administration. And I'll try to weave in there, if I don't forget, Glenn Youngkin's points today as well. And then, of course, we'll welcome your questions and comments later. We have a couple of our Rockstar team members here today. Some of you may know Christy Morton, our VP of External Affairs, former head of the Rural Center, and also Lindsay Barker, her deputy in External Affairs, who we're thrilled is here with us today as well. So I'm going to jump right in. And by the way, feel free if you have any questions along the way as well. So we don't necessarily have to wait just to the end. So let's talk a little bit about historical trends. You all know these kind of at a high level. This picture, by the way, about urban sort of rural divide on growth, and this is looking at employment growth specifically, is fairly similar to what we've seen across the country as a whole. If you look nationwide, the last 10 to 15 years, the big metros are growing faster than the mid-sized metros, are growing faster than the smaller metros, and so on to the disconnected rural regions. And we've seen that same kind of issue in the Commonwealth. Fortunately, Virginia's done a little bit better than the country as a whole. This is looking at growth compared to the baseline in 2001, so about 20 years ago, for rural Virginia in dark blue versus urban Virginia in light gray there. If we compare rural Virginia versus the rural U.S., you do see Virginia's done a little bit better over the last 20 years, but of course, both of them not seeing the kind of growth that we would like to see overall. And that's something we'd really like to see shifted. You've seen this probably most notably in population growth in urban Virginia versus rural Virginia. Again, you see the urban areas kind of racing ahead a little bit compared to rural Virginia there in the dark blue. And again, we can compare population change. This is population rather than employment I was showing you before for rural Virginia in blue versus rural U.S. So the rural Virginia has done a little bit better, but certainly not nearly what we would like to see overall in the Commonwealth of Virginia. Now, the composition of employment has changed a good bit over the last couple decades. I think you're aware that manufacturing, unfortunately, has gone down substantially, particularly in rural Virginia compared to 2001. This has happened nationally as well. I'm sorry, there's a question. Go ahead. Oh, you can't hear me. Is there a way to turn up the, I don't know if there's a way to turn up the volume on the mic. Do you all know? We'll see. I'll try to talk a little bit loudly. Is that a little better? Maybe not. Let me, if I hold the mic a little closer. Is that a little better? All right, I'll try to speak up. But manufacturing obviously has been under strain. Unfortunately, what's happened is that partly through trade, but largely through automation, manufacturers have been able to produce a lot more with fewer people. So that's happened in Virginia as well as across the country. It still represents a very important part of employment in rural Virginia compared to urban Virginia. This is something we've really emphasized with our state leaders as we've seen shifts due to population toward more Northern Virginia leadership, we've really tried to emphasize manufacturing is very, very important to rural and small metro Virginia compared to the more urban parts of the Commonwealth. Also, you see the similar kinds of trends in economic output as well, where manufacturing is a much bigger part of rural Virginia than it is in urban Virginia. As we look at jobs, you can also see when we look at announced job opportunities, manufacturing has really dominated in rural Virginia. So even though it's not a big driver of growth in the Commonwealth as a whole, it remains very, very important to our rural counties across the Commonwealth. As you can see on the right-hand side of the slide here, much smaller percentage of the urban locality job wins have been in those urban areas associated with manufacturing. We look at capital investments, a little bit more of a mixed picture, but still, again, you can see on that right-hand side that the manufacturing represents a small portion of capital investment in the urban areas, but still a very, very important part of growth in rural Virginia. By the way, one highlight of the call we had today with Governor-elect Youngkin was he really emphasized very strongly that he wants Virginia to be competitive in attracting new manufacturing projects. We've had a good number of significant wins across the Commonwealth the last several years in manufacturing, but we've actually heavily underperformed our southern counterparts in that space, particularly for the bigger projects that need well-prepared sites of 100 acres or more. I would say while the governor-elect hit on several different aspects of economic development today, the one thing he hammered the most, and Christy, keep me honest here, was the need to invest in prepared sites. So I think you can see that. By the way, Governor Northam has also supported that. I think there's a very good chance we're going to see that in his outgoing budget, and the governor-elect indicated his strong support for that investment as well. Looking at the importance, looking at rural Virginia compared to the Commonwealth as a whole, it's about 17% of all of our employment, about 15% of gross domestic product, and 24% of population. Why is the population a larger percentage than the economy? Part of that is that aging population in terms of the rural demographic mix in the Commonwealth of Virginia. So let me shift a little bit, and I'm going to spend the rest of today really talking about the future, and again, want to open it up to your questions at the end. We have obviously been hit by a very significant pandemic that's had big impacts across the Commonwealth. I'm going to talk a little bit about what recovery looks like. First of all, as we look at job changes over the decade through 2017, so this is when we were putting together our strategic plan several years ago. You all know this picture very well, that you kind of see growth in most of the urban crescent, but largely decline, at least in terms of employment, in much of the rest of Virginia. As we look at the forecast for the next few years, it is looking a little bit better, but we do still see a forecast of decline, particularly in the far southwest. Now, we'll tell you that the projects we've recently announced just in the last couple of years, projects like Tyson Foods and Morgan Olson, we actually think Southern Virginia, which Moody's forecast here is in the red, we think is actually almost definitely going to be in positive territory. So that is going to be green. Likewise, we're working on some exciting things on the Eastern Shore that I think will position them for growth. I think the one part of Virginia we really haven't yet cracked the growth story is the far southwest, the E region, if you will, which has not only had the challenges facing all of rural America, but also obviously the loss of coal extraction jobs and natural gas extraction as well. By the way, those were all Moody's forecasts. These are not VDP's forecasts. As we look at the forecast, we look at sort of employment in Virginia as a whole. Of course, you're familiar with the big drop that we had with the pandemic. You can see we are starting to come back, but we're still down about 200,000 jobs compared to where we were pre-pandemic. And then you can see the right-hand side of this slide, the forecast from Moody's on recovery. So, Virginia as a whole, they do expect to get back, in positive territory by the middle of next year. But what you'll notice is that urban crescent is expected to be in Q4 of 2022, but about 6 months or so later for the rest of Virginia, largely the rural parts of Virginia. So there is a gap really associated with the same trends that we saw pre-pandemic. If recovery slows down, we would actually expect that gap to grow even more. So one of the things we've really reinforced to both the current administration and the incoming administration is when we think about being competitive in economic development, a lot of it is really about trying to close this divide between the urban crescent, really largely Northern Virginia versus the rest of Virginia, particularly the smaller parts of Virginia. We see 4 big opportunities to accelerate growth coming out of this pandemic era. The first one is capturing manufacturing, reshoring, and new supply chain opportunities. You've seen some of those announcements recently, like in Petersburg, like in Wythe County with Blue Star. Really pleased about those. But I will tell you, in the next year, we are going to see in the United States the largest advanced manufacturing projects announced in U.S. history. I mean, just enormous projects. The last time I checked, we were competing for a prospect pipeline of $200 billion, and that's really dominated by several projects that are anywhere between $5 billion and up to $100 billion each. Enormous semiconductor manufacturing facilities, electric battery manufacturing facilities, electric vehicle assembly facilities. What do these projects need? Well, they need a lot of things, but the one thing they need that we really don't have is well-prepared large sites. We have a lot of identified sites in great communities, great locations, but for a variety of reasons, they're not really ready to accommodate the really big projects. So that's a huge opportunity for the next administration. And that's a big opportunity for rural Virginia as well. Second, we talk about accelerating digital Virginia. We are seeing with the pandemic, if you had to mention just sort of the biggest single shift in business and the economy that's been brought forth by the pandemic has been an acceleration of the digitization of business. More e-commerce, more streaming of videos, more all kinds of things with artificial intelligence, everything tech, basically, cloud computing, software, cybersecurity, data centers, and so forth, just exploding. Certainly most of this is going to the more metro parts of Virginia and the country, but we are seeing a growing level of activity considering smaller metros and rural regions as well. So that's going to be a big, big opportunity for us, particularly with the Tecton Investment Program, where we're doubling the number of master's and bachelor's grads in computer science and related fields. The third big opportunity we see is remote work and opportunities for that in rural and small metro Virginia. Now, I will tell you, it's not going to be quite as big as what we had hoped for originally. Our best sense right now is that the vast majority of the permanent shift is going to be not so much full-time remote work, but really hybrid remote work. So we will see, a few percentage points of a shift in people that are actually working 100% remote, but the vast majority of the shift is going to be a shift to hybrid, where people are coming to the office maybe 2 or 3 days a week, working home 2 or 3 days a week. That could mean that they shift from living, in the city to living in a suburb or ex-urban area. But for most people, it's not going to mean that they move from a big metro to a smaller area. There will be some of that, but it's not going to be as big as we had hoped initially. And then finally, the last key shift that we see is a need for reskilling. If you look at the makeup of the Virginia economy post-pandemic versus where it was before the pandemic in early 2020, we're going to see more jobs in business services and technology, fewer jobs in non-essential retail and hospitality. And so that means that while most people that lost their jobs in the pandemic will be able to go back to at least their previous occupation, if not their previous job, there will be tens of thousands of people that lost their job in the pandemic and will not be able to go back to their previous job or even their previous occupation. So reskilling is going to be really important. Fortunately, the General Assembly and the administration have funded things like G3 and the Fast Forward program and other things to really enable people to take on those rapid reskilling opportunities. But these four things, these are really the big things we've got to work on at the state level and to some extent in regions and localities to capture that post-pandemic growth. A little bit about our current pipeline. This is as of, I think, early November, the projects we were looking at. You can see manufacturing outside of food and beverage and life sciences, really the dominant piece. These are largely projects in smaller localities across the Commonwealth. You can also see a good bit of activity in supply chain, in food and beverage processing and so forth. So while we focus on the entire traded sector of the Commonwealth and we do a lot of tech sector projects, our bread and butter is really manufacturing opportunities in counties across the Commonwealth. This helps you kind of see a picture of that. This is a slide we share often when we're briefing new members of the legislature or the MEI Commission, simply looking, if we look at all the new announcements for sort of greenfield sites, including expansions, I should say, kind of the mix of where those are coming from. So when you look at the very top line, the Northern Virginia region, you can see technology and headquarters and corporate services is really, roughly 90% or so of all their activity. But when you look at most of the other regions in Virginia, particularly the more predominantly rural regions, manufacturing and supply chain really dominates, right? So when we're not as competitive in those two sectors, it's really exacerbating the economic divide between Northern Virginia and the rest of Virginia. That's why we've got to really make sure that we're more competitive in those areas. I did want to share a few examples of some recent projects that have gone to some of our smaller localities. We're very excited. The Blue Star project going to Wythe County. This is ultimately over several phases, more than $700 million capital investment, close to 2,500 jobs, really a huge win My first few weeks at VDP in 2017, I visited with county and lot 24. Many of you know that lot the county's been working on for many years. We're very excited to help get this big project there. We have the Shock project, very excited about that one going into Southern Virginia, 85 million, 355 jobs. The Tyson Foods project we announced recently, 300 million, 376 jobs there. That one's underway really, really quickly. Hershey was the sweetest win that we've had in a while. 135 million, 110 jobs there, and that was in the Shenandoah Valley area. Also 1901 Group, these guys have really been a pioneer in putting tech jobs into smaller and rural areas of the Commonwealth and partnering with Virginia Tech. If I'm not mistaken, they're recently acquired by Leidos, big growth opportunity in Virginia. Morgan Olson, this was actually the first big project that was supported by the Virginia Talent Accelerator Program. You may recall the big story that IKEA was announcing they were closing their last manufacturing plant in the entire United States in Pennsylvania County, and working with our great local partners and our great state partners, we were able to attract a project that not only helped to recover the 300 jobs that were lost, but actually is adding a total of about 700 total jobs, or a net increase of about 400. They're the vast majority of the way there already. And it was actually the testimonial and the case study for this project that took our new Talent Accelerator program to being ranked number 2 in the country out of previously outside the top 10 before we created that program. So we're really excited about that and the progress there. Merck, this is another big one in the Shenandoah Valley recently, $1 billion capital investment, 100 job expansion there. Those are just a few examples. There have literally been hundreds over the last few years. Now, while we're really pleased about the wins that we've had, and there have been a lot of wins across Virginia, a really good mix across Virginia, we are not yet having the kind of success that we would like to have. And so I'm going to be talking about what we can do here to improve. Let me just give you a sense. Some of you have seen me share this slide before, but when we think about our economic competitiveness and economic growth and really what drives that in the Commonwealth, we really summarize that on this one single slide. First of all, on the bottom, you've got our long-standing strengths, the great talent, great public schools in Virginia. We have the best schools in the South, roughly number 4 in the country, best higher ed system in America. We've got a great mid-Atlantic location. We've got a well-managed state, and for the most part, a pretty attractive, stable business climate. We've also had a lot of good things that have happened the last few years, probably most notably rural broadband investment. This went from literally about $1 million a year when I got here 5 years ago to now we're going to be over $1 billion, and really with the prospect of near ubiquitous broadband in Virginia over the next few years. There have been several innovations in workforce training and development. We have the Tecton Investment Program that I mentioned, some legal climate improvements that the Virginia Chamber championed, and transportation investments. But then ultimately, there's a few things that we have left that we really need to work on. One is early childhood education. While we are very strong in public education in general and in higher education in general, we're really not yet a leader in early childhood education. And childcare has been a huge obstacle for Virginia, as it is in other states. In fact, when you look at the challenges that our businesses are having in getting people back to work, I would say that number 1 or number 2 challenge is a lack of childcare. There were much fewer spots than we had there just a couple of years ago. Prepared development sites, and I meant to add in this slide, I don't have it in here, but we've been tracking the last few years when we compete for a manufacturing project. What's the most common reason that we lose? Basically 2 reasons that are at the top. Either that we don't have a site that's as prepared as a competing state, or the competing state offered 3 to 5 times what we offered in incentives. Now, you all know Virginia is very conservative about its finances, so we're not likely to make a big change, at least a big systemic change in incentives. But really, site preparedness is a form of infrastructure. And I think you're going to see a transformation in this next administration. I don't mean just the next administration, because the outgoing one I think is supporting it as well. But we are going to see a big increase in investments in prepared sites. We're really fortunate for all the great work that's already been done there. It's really ready to go. I want to mention a couple other things. International trade plan, huge opportunities to grow trade and FDI. Also statewide coverage for the custom workforce program. Those of you that are located in smaller localities, which is probably most of you, you know that the most common challenge that or concern that we face when we're trying to attract a significant new employer is, where am I going to get the qualified workforce? With the Virginia Talent Accelerator Program, we can tell a company, no matter where you locate in Virginia, if you will offer competitive wages and benefits, we will provide a fully trained, high-quality workforce to you better and faster than any other state can do it in America. It's a huge advantage. We're so proud of the progress with that. And finally, we've got to tell our story with a much stronger marketing effort. By the way, while I'm on this slide, when we visited with Governor-elect Youngkin today, and this was our whole staff. So we had roughly 150 people on the call. He made it absolutely crystal clear that economic development is going to be his top priority, that he wants every region in the Commonwealth to participate in the growth of the Commonwealth, and that he wants us to have the toolbox that we need to be successful. And he specifically highlighted significant state investments in prepared sites, in the Virginia Talent Accelerator Program, and in expanding marketing for the Commonwealth. And by the way, I think you're very likely to see some or all of those in Governor Northam's outgoing budget as well. So this is a very, very exciting time for us, all of us in the economic development community. I can tell you our team was texting me the whole time, just excited about what's coming next, not only the partnership, but the investment as well. I mentioned the Talent Accelerator Program. I just wanted to highlight for you a few of the projects they've done. We haven't yet done a project in every region, but you can see increasingly we're serving projects all across the Commonwealth. We've had about 7,000 jobs worth of announcements that were connected to that program that they're going to be supporting, and about 3,400 more jobs in the pipeline. We expect this program will be able to support, once it's fully funded, which we're anticipating next year, about 5,000 new direct jobs per year, plus occasionally a big mega project that they will fund with supplemental funding like Blue Star I mentioned earlier. I talked about site preparedness. The big challenge there, we got a lot of great sites that are identified, hundreds of them across the Commonwealth, but they're not yet in a position where they're really prepared to be competitive. And most of that's about speed to market. Many of you heard about the Ford project that was recently announced outside of Memphis, Tennessee. I don't remember the exact numbers, but it was order of magnitude about 5,000 new jobs, $5 billion in capital investment. That project considered the Commonwealth of Virginia. I talked to Ford, I think it was last week or week before, after they announced, and said, hey, I know we were considered, why did we get eliminated? They said, well, we think Virginia's got a great business climate. You've got great talent. We actually did business in Virginia before. Basically, you had everything we needed except a prepared site. They said the site we had proposed was a great site, but it needed literally hundreds of millions of dollars of work to sort of create a large flat pad area for them. There was Corps of Engineering permitting that would stand in the way and so forth. It just took us a longer amount of time to get ready. The site outside of Memphis, the state of Virginia had already put $170 million into that site before they got the project. Now, we're not suggesting going all the way to having hard infrastructure on the ground, but we do think for all the top priority sites of our regions and the Commonwealth that we should have done all the environmental work, all the engineering and planning work, right-of-way acquisition, et cetera, such that if we do get a project, or a prospect, I should say, we can confidently tell them that all of the infrastructure could be in place within 12 to 18 months. That's that tier 4 or better level. That's what we're shooting for. Today, 86% of our sites of 100 acres or above, and we're just showing those bigger sites here, are not at that tier 4 or better level. And if you look at it a little bit more closely, what we realized is while some of those sites, are technically tier 4, they're really only tier 4 for a smaller project. If you actually had a project that would need the whole site of 250 acres or more contiguous acreage, they're really not tier 4. And so what we're finding is that for the vast majority of these transformational projects, Virginia is getting considered again and again, and they're telling us again and again they like everything except our sites take too long to get ready versus the alternatives in competing states. So this initiative, we have an initiative that we're working on right now, working with the Northern Administration and the General Assembly leadership, as well as the incoming administration of Governor-elect Glenn Youngkin, is to put in a one-time $150 million expansion of the Virginia Business Ready Sites program. That would enable us to get about roughly 5 or 6 of our biggest sites truly project ready, sites like the Southern Virginia mega site at Berry Hill, or the Maymac site in Southeast Virginia, or the Sussex mega site and others. And then about a dozen or so mid-sized sites across the Commonwealth. And we do that in a matching grants program. It's a very well-developed program. We've got KPMG site selection practice helping us. We are ready to go, and I think it's very likely we're going to get that funding in this upcoming session. Another thing we can do to accelerate growth is to fully implement the International Trade Strategic Plan that was developed a couple of years ago in collaboration with state agencies and business leaders across the Commonwealth. We just need the funding to be able to implement these programs that are already working. We believe we can increase exports by roughly 50% over the current levels, which would take us from roughly 40th in the country today on a per capita basis for exports to roughly 20th over the next 15 years. And that would include both trade development as well as attraction of new trade intensive projects across Virginia. We're continuing to tell the story of Virginia and Virginia's localities and regions. Hopefully many of you, if not most of you, are getting our magazine today. It goes out quarterly, primarily goes out to leaders in corporate America and top site selection consultants across the country, and really showcases the great assets and quality of life in schools and workforce programs available in Virginia. That's just one example of what we're doing in marketing, but we need to do more. One of the things that Governor-elect Youngkin shared today was that he thinks our proposed expansion of marketing is very reasonable, and he is going to support it in the spring. Couple last things I wanted to mention. I wanted to touch base briefly on the Rural Think Tank. This is a group of people that we brought together about 4.5 years ago when we were going through our first big strategic planning process. We brought together rural development leaders from across Virginia. Christy Morton, who was leading the rural center at the time. We had Liz Povar, Carrie Chinnery. We had Bill Shelton with DHCD. So many folks that were really rural development champions, ODEC, and so forth. And we asked them one simple question. We said, what could the Commonwealth of Virginia do that we're not currently doing to position every region of Virginia for growth? And this was the list that they came up with in order. And this list, by the way, we've met with them several times since, and it's never changed. First of all, the first two are actually a tie for number one. One was to market rural Virginia. We really weren't marketing Virginia at all, let alone rural Virginia 5 years ago. Second was ubiquitous broadband, which seemed like a distant dream in 2017. Now it's actually going to happen. We talked about expanding our site inventory. By the way, these are coded by kind of the progress trajectory. So green means it's either done or it's very much on track. Yellow is we've made some progress, but there's gaps. And then red is we really haven't made any progress. Expanded site inventory. We've done all the research, we've got the plan, we've got a little bit of funding, but we really need to expand the funding. That's why that's in yellow. The custom workforce program is awesome. It's ranked second best in the country in both the national rankings. The only reason it's yellow is we don't have funding yet to really make it truly statewide. We expect to get that next year. We have had partnerships to fund significant projects where the legislative leadership, both Republican and Democrat, have supported some really special kind of creative packages, everything from Morgan Olson to Blue Star to Tyson Foods and others that I talked about earlier. So that's gone really well. Tax and incentive changes, we haven't done as much on that, but we do need to sort of keep that in mind that when we compete with these other southern states, particularly places like North Carolina and Georgia, they really do offer a pretty attractive business climate. They've got well-prepared sites, and very commonly they're offering 3 to 5 times per job, what we're offering. Now, we don't have a systemic solution for that, but we just need to recognize that we are losing some projects on the margin because of that. On community competitiveness, we did put together a local and regional competitiveness initiative. Most of your localities participate in that through your economic development organization and typically your regional EDO as well. And that's really provided kind of a blueprint for how localities can put themselves in a more competitive position. And then finally, civic leadership. We're thrilled that the Virginia Rural Center, I'm forgetting what it's called, but they're launching a new leadership initiative that's right in line with what we envisioned. So the good news is there's been a lot of progress, but as you can see, there's still a lot of work left to do. Finally, and by the way, most of this we shared with Governor-elect Youngkin as well as with former Governor McCullough, and before the election, both of them had offered to be very supportive. Finally, these are just a couple slides that we shared with them at the end of those briefings, just talking about these are the kinds of headlines you could be looking at the end of your term if you take a very aggressive approach and implement all these different initiatives. I'll just give you a second to read those. And then, we talked about the big initiatives, expanding the Business Ready Sites program, making the Virginia Talent Accelerator program a truly statewide initiative, expanding our out-of-state marketing efforts, fully implementing the international trade plan, and also investing in cultivating new growth sectors. So all those things together give us roughly 10 to 28,000 additional jobs per year. For the rural regions, that would definitely be enough to put every region of the Commonwealth in positive territory. It would also get us to the top 10 in the country. What we've really reinforced both with the outgoing administration and the incoming administration is, these things do take a little time to implement. So the more that you can fully fund them right off the bat, the faster you can get the results that we're talking about. And finally, these are just a few examples of some of the things that we talked about as early win opportunities. We created a brand new marketing organization for Virginia that's funded and led by CEOs of leading companies across the state called Team Virginia. We are going to be hosting with the governor the top 200 site consultants in the country in small group visits. This says 18 months, actually going to do it the first year because the governor wants us to speed it up. It's going to be a great way to showcase all the great things about Virginia, particularly our talent assets. We talked about expanding the Virginia Business Ready Sites program for every region to participate. The governor-elect's committed to that. We talked about the Virginia Talent Accelerator program, securing dozens more projects across smaller metros and rural regions. That's definitely going to happen. And it goes on and on. So there's a lot of exciting things that are happening in Virginia. There's a lot of progress, but we definitely have a lot of work left to do. The good news is that we have great alignment with our partners, with our board, with the Virginia Chamber and Blueprint Virginia 2030. Everything I've talked about is in that blueprint. And with the incoming administration, I think the outgoing administration as well. So I personally am very bullish on the next few years. I'm going to stop there. I'd be delighted to take any questions or comments or ideas you all may have for me. Yes. Christy, did I leave out anything notable from the governor-elect's comments this afternoon? I guess the only other thing I would add is he committed that he's going to spend a lot of his personal time on economic development, and that he's really committed to making sure that we're not just focused in Richmond, we're focused in the whole state.
People are being bashful, so I'll step in, Steve.
Okay.
Joe Lurch-Baco, staff. You know, our Economic Development and Planning Steering Committee came up with kind of a new look at economic development this year in our draft platform, and looking for state funding for regional economic development organizations. Just kind of wanted to see what your thoughts on that and what the possibility might be.
Yeah, it's a great idea. We've actually talked about it at VDP, Joe, for a few years. There's other states that have done that. I had it when I was Secretary of Economic Development in Louisiana. We actually did essentially a per capita funding level for each of the regional EDOs. There were a lot of good things that came from it. One was you could only get the funding if you actually had your whole region on board, you know, with the REDA, which we don't currently have in a lot of our regions of Virginia. So it was very helpful as kind of a catalyst for collaboration. It also required, as we would, if I would presume if this went forward, you know, a certain level of both public sector and private sector, local public sector and private sector, you know, contributions. The other thing I think could be really helpful that we did in Louisiana, that Ohio has done even more than we have, is to go to more of a shared system for tracking lead generation and projects. You know, right now we share a lot of information, but we're not actually on the same system. And I think potentially with that incentive of additional state dollars, you could see a much more tight integration between state efforts and regional efforts. So I do think it'd be positive. I would say that I'd want to make sure that we fund these top priorities I've talked about first, because they've really been very well vetted with both our locality partners and the regional partners and the Virginia Economic Developers Association. But I would definitely see that as a high potential opportunity as well. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Rodney Lusk. I'm a supervisor in Fairfax County. It's good to see you. Just want to also commend you again for the efforts connected to HQ2. And noticed on your slide 29, I believe you made a point that you've had additional growth in projects and activity as a result of HQ2. Could you speak to that first? And then second, there's this sense as you look at the benefits in Fairfax County, and we've seen a lot of kind of professional services types companies, and that's been kind of our bread and butter. And I'll say we're definitely happy to have that. But the question I have is, how do we get to a place where we can get to having product companies? I think we've got to think about this in a unique way in terms of the diversification, and that product companies is an area where we do not have as much exposure and much success. So on those 2 points.
Yeah, wonderful questions, Rodney. First of all, on HQ2, if you kind of step back to 2017, a lot of people don't know this story, but you might remember it. We had developed our strategic plan for economic development of the Commonwealth, and we'd identified our #1 growth opportunity statewide was to build a more thriving private sector centric tech sector. And then our biggest constraint was we needed a bigger talent pipeline. We had great talent that was here, but we weren't producing enough grads in those key fields like computer science, computer engineering, and data science. And so we had this idea to invest in a new tech campus in Northern Virginia and to invest hundreds of millions of dollars in computer science education. And I remember our board basically saying, well, do you think we could ever realistically get that money? And then a couple weeks later, we got the Amazon HQ2 RFP, and we just kind of took some of those ideas and put it into our bid, and we ultimately got all that funded. The reason that HQ2 was so exciting to us was not just the number of jobs, it was the fact that it was going to be really private sector focused. In fact, they actually only get incentivized if at least 90% of the jobs are private sector, not federal government focused positions. That was very, very important to us. And what we saw happen in Seattle and what we expect to happen, at least in Northern Virginia, as a result of that growth, is going to be the attraction of not only other major tech firms, and we're already seeing significant growth up there from Microsoft, Google, Facebook, and other big players. But we also think, particularly as it really gets going in the next few years, we're going to see more new startup ventures, more venture capital, and so forth. Now, your broader point, though, is very well taken about, essentially technology services versus more product development. And product development, of course, a lot more leverage, a lot more capital, a lot more attraction of talent that could come from that. I think we're going to see more and more of that as you see all these other entities start to cluster in that area. As you know very well, having worked at the Fairfax County Economic Development Authority, the challenge, I mean, it's been both a blessing and a curse, and well, not a curse, but a blessing and a little bit of a constraint, is that most of our tech sector has largely been directly or indirectly catalyzed by the proximity to the federal government. So naturally, there's a lot of services with cyber and federal defense and so forth that are connected to that. I think what we're going to see happen over the next few years is more of the private sector part of tech really taking off. You continue to see growth, forgetting the names of some of these companies, but Appian, for example, and a whole bunch of others that have either announced recently or we see working on big projects in the future. The big challenge in Northern Virginia, like the other big high-cost urban areas of the country, is housing supply. It's just a huge constraint right now. I kind of joke with my partners in Northern Virginia that the biggest thing holding back growth in Northern Virginia is housing. It's not like, how do we attract more jobs? It's how do we attract more housing to be able to accommodate all that? The other side of that coin, too, is making sure that we have really attractive mixed use kind of developments that are fun for young professionals to live in. I think we're going to see great things with that, with what Arlington and Alexandria are doing in particular. And I think also Fairfax has some really ambitious plans that you all are working on as well. So we're going to have to keep working on that together. But I do think my personal view is the next 5 years is very, very bright compared to what we were looking at 5 years ago in terms of the prospects for the kind of growth that you're talking about. The other thing I'd say with HQ2 is it's given us an entree for tech sector opportunities outside of Northern Virginia as well. And one of the things we've really appreciated that a lot of folks don't know about our deal with Amazon for HQ2 is that Amazon is committed to be an active economic development partner for the Commonwealth. So for example, when I mentioned Team Virginia, Amazon was one of the first companies to invest in that new marketing initiative. And Brian Huseman, one of their senior executives, is actually co-chairing the board. So that's just one example of how they're helping us. Sorry, that was a long answer to a short question. Thank you. Joe?
Sure. Stephen Joe Hines with Timmons Group. First of all, congratulations on your new position, and thank you very much for your service to the Commonwealth. You've done a fantastic job, and we're going to miss you here, that's for sure. Second, obviously, you're throwing out some big numbers. I remember when a $100 million project was a big project, then $1 billion was a bigger project, and obviously, we're talking about $100 billion. When you're talking about semiconductor industry, which is shifting its way back here to the U.S., and everybody who's having trouble buying a car, that's why. You're talking about some pretty major infrastructure components to something like that. And we're sitting here with a bunch of people who are elected officials probably sitting there thinking, how can I land a $100 billion investment? So what are some of the things that are required from an infrastructure perspective for those types of projects? And then is there anything here that these localities can do? Because reality is not it. If we land one of those in Virginia, that's probably going to be it for Virginia for a while. But what are some of those components that people need to be thinking of sitting here in the audience?
Yeah, great question. Well, first of all, I should say something I should have mentioned earlier. Many of you know Senator Warner. To the extent that we end up getting one or more of these plants, not just in Virginia, but in the United States, it's going to be in large part because of his bill. the CHIPS Act. The semiconductor industry over the last 20 years or so has largely left the United States and is developing in Asia and other parts of the world. He has a very innovative bill that we think is likely to pass. And if it does, it's really laying the groundwork for these projects to have, basically incentivizing domestic semiconductor manufacturing. Important not just for job creation and technology leadership, but also for national security. I can't say enough good things about that bill and the leadership he's provided on that. To give you a sense of the scale of these projects, the smallest one that I'm aware of is 17 billion. 17 billion. That's the smallest one I'm aware of. That's the one that's public. That's a Samsung project, I believe. By the way, we got eliminated for that one, unfortunately, because of site preparedness, but we're still in the hunt for a couple of the bigger ones. That was about 2,000 jobs. Some of the other ones go up to 5,000, 6,000 jobs. These are projects with average salaries, typically of at least $100,000 a year plus benefits. So really huge economic drivers. They have really unprecedented demands for water in particular, in some cases 10 to 20 million gallons a day. You kind of think about that, that's 10 to 20 million gallons a day, very large amount of water. So that limits the number of options for them. They're looking for very, very large prepared pads. I would say at least 700 acres, maybe 600 on the low side, 600, 700 plus, flat pad site for development. They also have fairly large requirements for electricity as well. I forget the numbers, but electricity, we're in pretty good shape. Actually, water, we're in pretty good shape, water and wastewater, but there will be some improvements. We learned for one of those big projects that a couple of our competitors, one of them has to spend 700 million just on water and wastewater infrastructure. The other one is 1.2 billion just on water and wastewater infrastructure. We do not have to spend that, fortunately, in the communities that we're working on. So we've got a couple of these we're still in the hunt for. They are in communities that were really forward-looking years ago and put significant dollars into large sites. Nevertheless, we're still not quite as ready as we would like to be. So I certainly wouldn't project you today that we're going to get one of these, but we're definitely working real hard in a couple regions of Virginia to attract those projects. But there are great examples along with those big electric vehicle assembly facilities that, you really across the Commonwealth, doesn't mean every locality, but every region should have at least one, one large prepared site for development that they could propose for high-tech manufacturing projects. Thanks, Jay.
Gary Deal, Culpeper County. Do you have any thoughts on what the mayor is doing in Miami as far as Bitcoin, opening it up to commerce, and thoughts about risk or advantages to the counties and jurisdictions?
And I'm sorry, who is doing on Bitcoin?
The mayor in Miami, what he's considering,
right.
what he's considering doing as far as opening up Bitcoin
Yeah,
commerce.
No, it's an interesting question. I certainly don't think I would encourage you all to jump on that just yet. The great thing about Virginia is there's so many great things about living here and doing business here that we don't necessarily have to be a first mover and try, something like that. I think we can watch a little bit, and if it gets traction elsewhere, I think we could look at it further. I do think cryptocurrencies, I think, are going to be really, really important, and we do have some really cool companies that are both here and others that we're looking at cultivating that. But if I were, from just Stephen Moret's point of view today, if I were a county, I'm not sure I would put that at the top of my list. I'm not saying you shouldn't track it, but I think there's other things you could do that are more obviously definitely high ROI, and that might be something down the line that could deserve some more attention. I'm not an expert on it, but I'm certainly tracking all the different things out there, and I still think there's a little ways ahead to see where that goes. The other thing we've got to keep our eye on is, you saw, I think in China, there was a huge crackdown on cryptocurrency, and I think there's quite a lot of interest in federal policymakers at the Fed and Treasury. I'm not saying it'll go away, but I think it potentially could be more regulated than it is now, and that might to some extent constrain some of the business models that are out there. So I would just tread carefully, would be my thought.
If I could just follow up on a couple of things that Joe shared. First of all, I also thank you for your service to the Commonwealth.
Thank you.
Excellent. And to follow on his question, could you speak briefly about transportation, the transportation component? You talked about the acreage and the infrastructure.
Yes.
But I know a lot of our rural localities who have lots of acreage don't even have a 4-lane
Yes.
in their counties.
Yes, no, great question. So the way we're thinking about this, and I really think we've come up with a good way to balance sort of risk and reward, is that we're not suggesting that folks initially build everything out as much as think about what you ultimately want to attract and make sure that you've gone far enough down the track that you only need 12 to 18 months left to finish. In most cases, that will mean you don't necessarily have to do the hard infrastructure yet, but you would do the rights of way acquisition, you would do the engineering designs and planning and all that. You do all the environmental work. By the way, the other big advantage of doing it this way is, it's about 80% roughly less cost to kind of get to that point as opposed to actually building it all out. But it also means that you avoid the white elephant problem, which is, the county puts a lot of money into a site and some of those are going to sit there for a while. I mean, we've got to think, one of the reasons why it's so critical for the state to be a bigger partner in this than we have been is that, if we have, let's say, I'm making this up, but a few dozen sites, every year, a bunch of those are going to get taken up and we'll have good announcements. So at a statewide perspective, we're going to have a nice return on the portfolio. Every year you'll get several more sites, you'll get announcements. But if you're a single locality with one site, right, your population, your citizens are thinking, well, what's the status of that specific site? And by having this be a little bit more of a targeted investment where it's not quite as visible and not as costly until you actually get a real good project in hand, I think it enables you kind of manage expectations a little bit better. And of course, the other thing you're able to say is the state, the plan for this, and I think it's almost certain to be the final structure, is that we're going to provide a 1-to-1 state match for non-distressed localities, 2-to-1 state to local for distress, for single distress, and 3-to-1 for double distressed. And therefore the state is really going to be a significant, player in this, and hopefully have this be a manageable cost that you all can accommodate. So on roads specifically, it would be basically saying, well, what kind of infrastructure do we need to attract the kind of project that we want? How long would it take to build that? Let's do all the planning work and maybe some light, hard costs just to get us right up to that 12 to 18 month timeline, but without going all the way. And you certainly could go all the way. I mean, if you do have a site that's totally prepared, I mean, that is the gold standard, but it's 4 to 5 times as much to do that. And so I think for most localities, kind of getting to that tier 4 level, but not all the way to tier 5 might be the smart way to go. Thank you.
Will there be funds coming to help localities with things such as natural gas that have, great sites, but that's the only thing that's holding them up?
Yes, absolutely. We have talked about really all the different costs. So planning, rights of way acquisition, natural gas infrastructure, water, wastewater infrastructure, electrical infrastructure. We are going to try to take advantage of what the utilities are allowed to do. And there are a couple bills that we've worked on that give them a little bit more flexibility. But the basic idea is to support whatever's needed to get the site ready. There's a whole process. Some of your localities are already, pitching for, we have a small round of funding, about $7 million now, again, hoping for $150 million next year, but we do have a $7 million round going through right now. I think there were, Christy, around 40 million, give or take, of applications. You can see there's a lot of demand that's out there. And I think if we're able to get the 150, there's going to be even more participation then. But it's a really well-designed process. And one of the nice things about it is we've got some nice sort of orientation materials, and then we can actually advise you at every step of the way. So you don't have to just figure it all out, send it in and hope for the best. We can actually give you a sense of what type of application, what types of funding will be the most helpful. We have right now, many of you know John Loftus, our sites manager on our team, who knows the whole Commonwealth really well. We're actually creating a whole dedicated team. We're going to have, I think, Christy, about 5 people full-time working on this because we're going to have so many sites we're working on. And one of the things we hope to really be able to offer you is not only kind of technical support, but also with KPMG that actually helps companies pick sites. We're going to have that professional third-party perspective that can say, this is how my clients would actually look at your specific site. And they will physically visit the site with you, tell you what works, what doesn't work, and so forth. So we've got some catching up to do, but I think we've got a really good plan, really good team, and we're about to have the resources we need to get there really quickly.